Welcome to another edition of the College 12-Pack. I'm your host, Patrick Kahn. With me, as always, Tyler Natuno of LSU Tigers Wire for the win. Tyler, we've gone through the ACC. We've gone through the Big 12. Now we get to start talking about the Big 10, and then obviously next week is the SEC. So we're going to finish it with the heavy hitters. And, I think it's interesting, just real quick before we really dive into this, I was interesting at Big 12 media days when Big 12 Commissioner Brett Yormark came out and said that they're the third best conference in the country. That's a lot of shade to throw at ACC, but he might be right. Well, he might be wrong. But I just thought it was interesting that he would come out and say that and just really throw the first punch.
Well, not only is it shade at the ACC, but it's also like a little bit of a cell phone, isn't it? Because you're kind of just I mean, obviously it's true, but they're tacitly admitting that they're not up to par with the SEC and Big Ten, which, I mean, honestly, that's not the worst marketing decision I've ever heard. I mean, no one would believe them if they tried to claim otherwise. So now they're making the pretty valid claim that they're the obvious number three, which I would agree with.
Yeah. It was interesting to me that he would say that, but you're right. It is kind of like you said, a cell phone where it's like, well, we're number three behind the SEC in the Big Ten, but also those two conferences are filled with heavy hitters, and those heavy hitters we're going to talk about today when we get into the Big Ten. And truth be told, let's kick this thing right off. As we've done with the ACC and Big 12, we're going to go through our superlatives, and let's start it off with the Offensive Player of the Year. There's so many options here, I think, where you look at Quinshon Judkins, the newcomer kind of coming in, running back at Ohio State. There's Will Howard. But for me, I really think Dillon Gabriel, Offensive Player of the Year here from the Oregon Ducks. We saw what he did for 2 years at Oklahoma. Again, with what we've seen, when he's healthy, he's one of the best quarterbacks in the country. The problem is we haven't seen him play a full season without having some kind of injury issue. But I still think just based on what he's able to do and what we saw Bo Nix do in this offense, I think Dillon Gabriel is an upgrade, as far as the explosiveness that they're going to have. And he's going to have a major weapon that I'm going to talk about here in a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I think this Offensive Player of the Year is as wide open, certainly more wide open than any of the conferences we've talked about so far. There's really a lot of directions you could go here. I mean, I think Gabriel's a really solid pick, though. Like, very experienced quarterback, and like you said, when healthy, looks pretty good. I mean, I think that he did a decent job of managing to stay healthy at Oklahoma. Like, I think especially this past season, like, I think you've got to be semi-optimistic in that regard. And like you said, like, I think his versatility in terms of what he's able to do in the run game as well. I mean, I really think he adds more than what Bo Nix can do. Like, I think this is an upgrade over Bo Nix, assuming he's staying on the field. And I know that's saying a lot for a guy that just went in the top 15 of the draft, but I think Bo Nix was a little bit limited in ways that I don't think Dillon Gabriel is. Like, I think they could really open up this offense, especially with, a guy like Evan Stewart coming in.
Yeah, they've got a ton of weapons, but I thought it was interesting when we were discussing this, and you opted to go with a player who's on a team that nobody's really talking about, and that's kind of hilarious considering they won the national championship last year.
Yeah, I mean, and I'm a Michigan skeptic too. Like, they lost the 15 guys got drafted, and Jim Harbaugh's moving on. They have a first-year coach. So, like, there's a lot of reasons to think that a step back is going to happen here, and I think it probably will. Like, I look at this team and see something along the lines of, like, 8-4 probably. But with that being said, I think Donovan Edwards is poised to have an absolutely massive season. Was really, really good in 2022, even splitting carries, because he, averaged 7.1 yards a carry that year. We saw the production drop off this past season. Blake Corum had a huge year. Obviously that, harmed him a little bit. And then, there was kind of a negative narrative building up about Donovan Edwards that he did a pretty good job of silencing in that national championship game, went for over 100 yards. I want to say 2 touchdowns as well. So it was really, really productive for them in that game. I think when you look at the questions this team has on offense, like no more Blake Corum, I think the quarterback position is a huge question. I think we kind of
Yep.
presume it's going to be Alex Orji. It might not be, but either way, I mean, Alex Orji is a guy that we've really only seen be used in a more of a change of pace wildcat kind of capacity. So we don't really know what this pass game is going to look like. They're going to lean on Donovan Edwards really hard, and assuming that offensive line is somewhat comparable to where it was last year, I don't see any way that he doesn't just by sheer usage have an incredibly productive season.
Yeah, and you're talking about Donovan Edwards is a guy that would be a starter at basically any other program the last couple of years, just because he wouldn't have Blake Corum in front of him. And Blake Corum, was a guy that we saw set records at Michigan. And yeah, I think you're right. Donovan Edwards is another great pick. What's interesting about him is I was actually a little shocked when they picked him as one of the 3 cover athletes for college football 25. Not that he didn't deserve it, not that he hasn't shown his ability. When you look at the other 2, I thought it was interesting they went with a running back. When there are some big name wide receivers around the country, but I guess you could say they did have one wide receiver, Travis Hunter, if that's how you classify him. Let's talk about defensive player of the year, and we're both going Michigan guys here, so very interesting. You obviously seem to go with the bigger name, I would say. A lot of people are going to know who your guy is. But I'd like to start with Mason Graham. I just think when you look at what he's able to do defensively, and I think when we look at the question marks at Michigan, I feel like there's a lot less questions about their defense. And any questions that you might have with this defense are going to get answered early on. Week 2, Texas is coming in. I mean, that is a massive chance for them, and he's going to be going up against a very experienced offensive line, so he's going to get tested early. But I think Mason Graham, just his ability to be disruptive, to get after the quarterback, to just create chaos in the backfield is a reason why, for me, I'm looking at him as defensive player of the year.
Yeah, I think I'm maybe not quite as high on Michigan's defense as an overall unit, just because of the lost production and the fact that Jesse Minter, the defensive coordinator from last year, followed Jim Harbaugh to Los Angeles. I still, though, I mean, I think that's a great pick with Graham. Like, I think, first of all, a guy who I think a lot of times defensive tackles, the stats don't always tell the whole story, because they're more of a, they more create production for other people rather than themselves.
Right.
But in spite of that, he had a pretty productive year as a pass rushing defensive tackle. Had 3 sacks, I think 7.5 tackles for loss. Was the defensive MVP of that Rose Bowl win over Alabama. So really had some strong performances down the stretch, especially as they won that national title. Like, I think that's a really good pick. And he's definitely going to be the anchor of that front 7. I'm looking at a guy that's in the defensive backfield for them. Guy a lot of you are probably familiar with if you've been paying attention to the rollout for college football 25. He's the number 1 overall rated player in the game, is Will Johnson, the cornerback there. A guy who, going into his junior year, a 2-year starter there, not insane production-wise, 7 picks and 7 pass breakups in those 2 years, but like, this is a really good athlete. A ball hawk, a guy that can close out, goes up and gets it. I think he's poised for a huge breakout year this year, a guy that you're probably going to see go in the top 10-ish of the NFL draft next year. So I think between Mason Graham and Will Johnson, I think you have 2 very huge pieces. We'll just see how everything kind of coalesces around them.
Yeah, and it's interesting, again, just kind of like to my point of Graham. You think about Will Johnson's likely going to be the guy that they're going to line up against the best receiver, whoever it is. Week 2, Isaiah Bond, Alabama, a guy that has the ability to make some plays. Obviously, he's going to be a little bit familiar with him from the Alabama game in the Rose Bowl. So there's that, but he's also going to have to go up against Ohio State at the end of the year, and that team is chock full of wide receivers. You got to slow down, and I'm eager to see how they look, and do they play with the same tenacity without Minter now not calling the plays on defense. Like I said, I'm a little less worried about the defense. I know they lost a lot of production, but they still have plenty of talent there. Let's talk newcomer of the year, and we're going to get out of Ann Arbor for this one. Newcomer of the year, Tyler. This is a guy who you've come on here many times, and you're you're pounding the table for this guy. So I'm gonna go ahead and let you take it away with your pick for newcomer of the year from the Ohio State Buckeyes.
Yeah, a guy that, full disclosure, I initially had as my defensive player of the year and ultimately switched these around. I think it's a 1A, 1B thing. I've got Caleb Downs. I think, we've talked about all the high profile transfer moves this offseason. Maybe this wasn't the most high profile, but I think it could prove to be the most impactful when you look at what this guy did as a freshman at Alabama last year. I mean, playing DB as a freshman in the SEC is hard under any circumstances. To play and start on a unit as good as he was on and have the production he did. I mean, 107 tackles last year, I think. 107 tackles. This guy was one of the best defensive backs in the country as a freshman playing in the SEC. I mean, to get him on top of, a defense that was already good. Like the defense was not the thing that held this team back last year. And now you add the best defensive transfer in the country on top of all the additions on offense, which I promise we're going to get into that as well as we progress in this episode. But I look at Caleb Downs and I think he's going to come in and be absolutely dominant in this conference on day one.
And not only that, you're probably going to see him at running back a little bit too. I mean, there's been a lot of talk about throwing him in there. Not that Ohio State needs any help at running back, considering who they have already with Travion Henderson. Oh, and you only added Quinshon Judkins, one of the best running backs the last 2 years. But, man, I'll tell you what, I'm looking forward to October 12th. Yeah, we got Texas OU Red River rivalry that weekend. But we also have at Autzen Stadium in Eugene, Ohio State, Oregon. You went with Caleb Downs. How about a guy who's going to have to try and tackle? I'm talking about Evan Stewart from the Ducks. He was a guy that I really, he was dynamic with Texas A&M, but I never felt like that offense was going to really show what he can do on the field. And now Dan Lanning gets him, and he's got Dylan Gabriel throw into him. I really think that he's going to be dynamic, and I really think that he has what it takes to be the newcomer of the year in the Big Ten. He's a guy he can. When you watch Evan Stewart, and I watched him in Texas during his high school career in Frisco, all you got to do is get him the ball and get out of the way. That's the type of player that he is. He can take over games.
Yeah, I love Evan Stewart. I think this guy's awesome. I think it's an awesome pickup for Oregon. I watched him a decent amount at Texas A&M, covering the SEC the last couple of years. This guy, I would almost compare it. I'm not comparing him as a player, but comparing the situation a little bit to what Marvin Harrison Jr. did at Ohio State last year with Kyle McCord. I think that, the way A&M used him, he was such a huge part of the offense. He was their best playmaker, and they got him the ball so often. I don't think, though, like you said, that system was built to maximize his abilities. I think he's in one now that is. And I think when you look at the other pieces around him, he's not going to have to be the guy that does it all himself anymore. I think the quarterback play, I like Connor Wegman, and he didn't play that much last year. We'll see how Max Johnson looks at UNC, but I don't think either of those guys, at least right now, are up to where Dylan Gabriel is. So I think improved quarterback situation and just the weapons around him, the better scheme, better coaching, I think this guy is poised to be maybe the best receiver in college football this season.
I would say that I think if Wegman stayed healthy, he would have been a lot better. Evan would have been a lot better for the Aggies last year. But yeah, you're right. I mean, they're going from that to he's going from those quarterbacks. Now he's going to Dylan Gabriel, and I think Dylan Gabriel's ability just to get the ball in their hands, he can create in the pocket, scramble. That's where I think when they get into those scramble drills, I think that's where Evan Stewart is absolutely going to eat. In the secondary at the next level. And that's why I've gone with him as my newcomer of the year. You're going with Caleb Downs. We're going to see him one-on-one potentially October 12th in Eugene. That is going to be must-see TV and in the new look Big Ten. All right, so let's talk about head coaches. And once again, we're going with that Oregon versus Ohio State dynamic, maybe a precursor to the Big Ten title game, perhaps. Let's talk about head coach of the year. I'm going to go with a guy that I talk about all the time, Dan Lanning. Guy had, we've talked a lot about Ohio State having the best offseason. If it's not Ohio State, it was Dan Lanning in Oregon. their ability, the guys that they brought in, obviously moving to the Big Ten, and they just got recently got a commitment from the number one wide receiver in the 2025 class, DeCorian Moore out of Duncanville, Texas. He's another dynamic weapon. Oregon just has a habit of going into the state of Texas and getting premier playmakers. If you remember LaMichael James and plenty of other Oregon Ducks over the years. But really, the job that Dan Lanning is doing, he's a fiery coach. He's fun. Man, I feel like after listening to Dan Lanning, he makes you want to run through a brick wall.
Yeah. And going back real quick, that DeCorian Moore thing was particularly crazy. A guy who had decommitted from LSU. Like, everyone thought this guy was going to Texas. Texas kid, really a shocker committing to Oregon. Like, yeah, I think you nailed it. I mean, Dan Lanning is a rising star. I don't really know how you could look at it any other way. I mean, truthfully, like, until I see pretty convincing reporting to the contrary, I'm going to believe he was the first choice at Alabama. I think that was the case. And I think there was a good reason for that. I think this guy is ascending. I think this program's ascending. You know, we've seen some things this week about their backing from Phil Knight and Nike in terms of NIL and stuff. Like, they have the resources. And I think now they have a staff that's really taking advantage of it. I mean, I personally have said and stand by that Ohio State had the best offense or off season, of anyone in the country. And I think that's true, but I think Oregon is right up there with them. Like, you look at, not only did they pull Dylan Gabriel and Evan Stewart from the portal, they pulled the quarterback for the future and Dante Moore, a guy who was the top quarterback in the 2023 class, up and down at UCLA this past year, but the talent's there. I think you got to like the potential, especially knowing he's not going to have to play this year, barring injury. I mean, I think that's a great pick for Coach of the Year. And I mean, I think they have a good chance to win the Big Ten this year. I think it would be surprising if they don't make the CFP this year. And if that happens, there's a good chance he'll end up being Big Ten Coach of the Year.
You know, and honestly, you brought up Dylan Gabriel and getting Dante Moore. It kind of feels like where Dylan Gabriel just came from in Oklahoma with Jackson Arnold, one of the top quarterbacks of that class. He didn't really have to play until Dylan Gabriel hit the transfer portal at the end of the year after Oklahoma was essentially eliminated from any shot at getting to the college football playoffs. So it could be another situation. Now, your head coach that you got for head coach of the year, not shocking at all, right? You're talking about Ryan Day, Ohio State. The man that Jim Harbaugh once said was born on third base.
Yeah, there isn't to this pick, there's an element of desperation to it. It's just like, please, Ryan Day, please get it done this time. I feel like I put myself out on the line to defend this guy quite a bit. And I think he's going to prove me right this year. I really do. I think all the moves they did were not only, big flashy moves, going to get guys like Caleb Downs and Quinshon Judkins, like you've mentioned, and Will Howard, who I think is an upgrade at quarterback over Kyle McCord. We'll see just how good he can be. I don't know if he's going to be a Heisman candidate this year, but I think he can certainly do a lot more than Kyle McCord could. But not only is it the flashy moves, I think he made a lot of moves that were understanding of the shortcomings they had last year. I think going to get Chip Kelly as OC, a guy who is, so good at scheming out the run, with how good Day is when it comes to the passing game. I think that's a really impressive combination, especially when you look at the running back room of Quinshon Judkins and Travion Henderson. These guys could be world beaters this year, and they've still got talent at the receiving core, despite, Julian Fleming in the portal and obviously MHJ going to the draft. But it is just kind of you got to get it done this year. I mean, they've completely loaded the roster up. To me, they're the clear favorite to win the national championship, and they should silence all the critics this year. And if they don't, we're going to have a different conversation.
And you brought this up for Oregon. Let me bring it up for Ohio State. They got their quarterback of the future, Julian Sayin, 5-star guy from Alabama. Signed, Nick Saban retires, and then he's off to Ohio State. They very similar to Oregon, getting their quarterback of the future 5-star guy, which makes that very interesting. But you're right. If Ryan Day doesn't win the Big Ten and make some noise in the college football playoffs this year, there's going to be a lot of stress in Columbus this next season. Now let's get away from the Oregon dynamic. Let's get away from the Ohio State dynamic. Let's talk about our surprise team, and I'm going to start with Nebraska, Dylan Raiola. You look at Nebraska, they have nowhere to go but up, right? They suffered through the Scott Frost. Then obviously he gets fired a couple games into the season, and then they go and get a head coach who's a program builder. I think when you look at Nebraska, they have nowhere to go but up. But I also think that they have something to build upon after last year, and that's why that I believe that the Cornhuskers could be on their way back. I'm not going to say the Huskers are back. The running joke we've had about Texas for years. Texas is back, folks. I'm just going to go ahead and say that. But Nebraska, they're on the way, and I think this is going to be the start of a promising build in Lincoln.
Yeah, and let's just be clear that what's back for Nebraska is very different than what's back for Texas.
Yes.
But yeah, I do agree. Like, I think that's the clear pick here, right? Like, when you look at, honestly, I think they were a little bit disappointing last year. I kind of thought they would get a little bit more out of that year one run, but I still like Matt Rule. I think this was a good hire, like, from a process perspective. I think you can kind of toss out the Panthers thing. It is what it is. This dude's college track record is pristine. I think they've got a good shot at the very least of, like, getting back to their first bowl game since 2016, which is unbelievable, by the way. No, having gone bowling in 8 years. So, I mean, I think, like you said, Raiola, that was a huge move. Looking at the roster, like, he's probably gonna have to start this year. I mean, they don't really have anyone else that's, the obvious contender there. I think, assuming talent sort of separates wheat from chaff, like, I think he's probably gonna be the guy there. I will say they've got a veteran defense. They've generally portaled pretty well. Added Micah Miskua, pretty good guard from Florida. So, like, I think that this is a solid middle of the pack Big Ten team this year. And I think that's probably in year one of the expanded Big Ten. No one really knows what to expect. I think that would be fine. That's definitely good progress.
Yeah. And let's not forget, they have Isaiah Nair, who transferred to Texas, blew out his knee in the spring. So we didn't even get to see him last year, but he was a guy that really stood out at Wyoming. I think that's a good weapon to get the ball in the hands of. You talked a little bit about, obviously Dylan. Yeah, you're right. Looking at this roster, quarterback wise, yeah, he's probably gonna have to start. But based on what we saw in the spring game, he might be worth the hype. He might, he's a 5-star guy, signee, number 1 overall quarterback, number 1 overall prospect of that class. I mean, he looks to have the talent. He has the NFL bloodlines. He has the Nebraska bloodlines. But I am buying in because of Matt Rule. Year one with a new football program, we saw it at Temple. He went 2-10. We saw it at Baylor. I think he was 1-11 or 2-10, something around that. The very next year, he always leads them to either a winning record or a bowl game. The second year at Temple was 500, but I think 6 wins at Temple is a massive. I mean, you might as well just go ahead and give him a bowl victory for that. I mean, the fact you got the 6 wins there. We saw what he did with Baylor. And then now he's got Nebraska. And I think when you look at the talent, when you look at what he's going to have around him, there's more talent in the conference now with the extra teams, but I still think Nebraska should be bowling this year. Huge reason why it's going to be Matt Rule. So I think we're in agreement. Nebraska is one of those teams. This next one is kind of I don't know if I can buy in with you, but I certainly understand the sentiment going with the Rutgers Scarlet Knights. This team is fascinating to me because any other head coach is leading this team, they're not winning anything. But when it's him, when it's the Rutgers head coach, and I think everybody knows who we're talking about, the Rutgers, they're an interesting team, but I don't know how much I buy in, but I like the pick.
Yeah, I mean, look, like, I know no one's talking about this team in the post-expansion Big Ten, but like they went 7-6 last year, and you know what? They don't have to play in the Big Ten East anymore. The Big Ten East no longer exists, so things get a little bit nicer for Rutgers.
Yep.
And when you look past the fact that they're going to be less talented than a lot of the teams in that conference, you see a team that ranks top 10 in returning production. Defensively, they're number 6, so a lot of experience on that side of the ball. Offensively, we'll see. They got a transfer quarterback from in the conference, Ethan Kalimanakis from Minnesota, who was okay last year. I wouldn't say he was great by any means, but he was okay. We'll see how that works out. But I think they've got pretty solid supporting cast around him. They're bringing back Kyle Monangai, a 1,200-yard rusher from last year. Dymere Miller was an FCS All-American last year at Monmouth, transferring in, had almost 1,300 yards, 9 touchdowns. So, you'll just kind of have to see how all that gels together. But I think there's reason to be semi-optimistic. When I'm kind of looking at, I think the bottom half of this Big Ten is a little, it could be kind of bleak for a lot of those teams. I think this team has a bit of a sunnier outlook than a lot of those squads do. Like I kind of see this as a team that's going to finish more toward the middle than the bottom.
Yeah, I think when you look at the roster that Greg Schiano has, it's not great, right? I mean, we both agree. But when you look at like really the latter half of their schedule, I think they're going to have a tough matchup against Washington. But luckily, it's going to be in Piscataway, so that helps a little bit because you're asking a Washington team to fly across from coast to coast. They're going to have a tough matchup against Wisconsin and USC, but then latter half of the season, and they close out against road trip to Michigan State. I think that there is an opportunity there, and they're going to get tested because they got to play Virginia Tech. But they start the season against Howard and Akron. Okay, so that's probably 2 wins right off the bat. Can you find me 4 more? They play Nebraska, who's trying to come back. That might be an opportunity there. They get a UCLA team that we don't really know much about in terms of what they're going to be. It's a lot of projection with that team. So I think it's a great pick. I can totally see why you went with Rutgers here. Truth be told, if you would have told me, hey, I'm going with Nebraska, I probably would have had a hard time figuring out which team that I think could really surprise. Although I think year 1 Michigan State might be a good pick, but I'm definitely going to say hats off to you with Rutgers here. Let's talk about the title game, Big Ten title game. Tyler, I think we're going out on a limb here. You have the Oregon Ducks going up against the Ohio State Buckeyes, and I have the Ohio State Buckeyes going up against the Oregon Ducks. We're in agreement. I think these are the 2 best teams. I wanted to go devil's advocate here and try to throw in another team, but I'm not sold on the Nittany Lions. That would probably be my other option, and I just don't know what to make of their quarterback situation. He's good, but is adding a new offense coordinator going to be enough to really overtake Ohio State? I don't know, and I'm actually excited. I will be very excited if this is the Big Ten title game because I think after that October 12 game, I think everybody's going to be itching for the rematch.
Yeah, and I'm with you. Like, I think Penn State is the team that you would have to say would be the next one up. I'm actually I'm fairly high on Penn State. I think they're going to be pretty good this year. I just don't really think they're going to be. I think they're clearly the less talented than these other 2 teams. I don't really see them being that much better than I'm projecting. And I think for them to get in there, one of Oregon or Ohio State would have to be have a pretty significant letdown. I really just don't see that happening. I think they're both going to be really good teams. I think this is the game. I think we're going to see the rematch. Obviously, they're playing on October 12th in Columbus. Is that game in Columbus?
No, Eugene.
It's in Eugene. Okay. So yeah, could definitely be an interesting rematch.
Yeah, I agree with you very much. My big thing is if Penn State is to get into this, they're going to have to win November 2nd against Ohio State. I think that's the only way, and hope that Ohio State is the team that loses to Oregon, gives them 2 losses, and then obviously Penn State can only afford 1 loss, but they can get in that way. The good thing is that's in Happy Valley. The bad news is they have had really a hard time beating Ohio State each and every year. And the good news for Penn State is you don't have to play Michigan this year. You don't have to play both, but you still have to play Ohio State. Yes, it's at home, but Ohio State's defense is really good. Their offense is loaded, and I don't know if I buy into Drew Alar enough to think that they can actually overcome all of that.
Yeah, I mean that's kind of mostly where I stand as well. Like I just think that, you know, I think Penn State, they didn't flip the roster like crazy. Like I think you have to believe that Drew Aller is going to take a step. You have to believe that Andy Kuttlenicki, the new offensive coordinator, is going to, just get a lot more out of him. They'll have something at least, similarly dynamic to what we saw at Kansas. I don't know if it'll be as effective, but that's what you've got to hope for. I mean, also new coordinator on the defensive side of the ball. Like, yeah, there's just too much change here and not enough moves that I think are going to move the needle for me. Like, I think they're clearly the number 3 team. I just don't think they're that close to the top 2.
And unfortunately, they're probably not going to get the Big Ten title game. But hey, not getting to the Big Ten title game, you can still get to the college football playoff. Expanded field this year. We're going with the 5-7, 5 conference champions, 7 at-large bids. How many spots do you think the Big Ten is going to be taking in this year's 12-team league?
Yeah, I literally had to do a mock field in my head to think this one through. I think it's probably going to be 3. I think it's hard for me to believe it's more than 3 just because I think the SEC is getting 3 at the minimum. And that's assuming that Big 12 doesn't get anyone else. ACC doesn't get anyone else. Like there's a decent chance one of those leagues will get a second team in.
And, at least Notre Dame doesn't go undefeated.
And Notre Dame. So, I think I'm sticking at 3, and I'm going to say the 2 that we have in the championship, and then the one that we're saying is next up. This is a really huge year for Penn State. They don't have to be perfect to get in. They don't have to beat Michigan and Ohio State. They have margin for error. They don't even have to play for the Big Ten championship, like you said. And it really just comes down to can Drew Aller be the quarterback they need him to be? Because they've got, I think, some good pieces still. I think Nick Singleton is an elite running back. We'll see Julian Fleming. Ohio State receiver transfer hasn't played a ton, but a former 5-star. You got to like the potential there. And then on defense, they got a guy from Georgia, and AJ Harris, another former big-time recruit. So, they have – I'm not saying they haven't made moves. They've made some moves, and I think they're this just needs to be the year where Franklin gets over the hump. And getting over the hump would just mean having a season similar to the ones they've had the last couple of years. So, they need to get it done.
Yeah, and I think I agree with you 100% on the 3 teams and 3 getting into the college football playoffs. I would have loved to come up with a 4th team, but considering all the moving parts, and when you look at the SEC getting 3 minimum, I don't see a world where I can throw in a 4th Big Ten team. It's really tough when you try to, like you said, try to do the scenarios. So I'm going to go Ohio State, Oregon, Penn State. I'd probably go Oregon then Ohio State because I'm going to pick Oregon to win the Big Ten title this year. But still, same teams. Which this is going to be the exciting part. Like you said, Penn State doesn't have to win to get it. It doesn't have to win out. They don't have to be perfect. And like other sports, like we've seen in basketball, in baseball, and in the NFL playoffs to an extent, all you got to do is make it. And, once you're in, then you get hot, and then hopefully you're playing for a title. And I think that's kind of the way Penn State's got to play it. All right, so let's talk about the newcomer that's going to have the best season. Okay, Tyler, you can't say Oregon. That's the easy answer. So,
yeah,
who you got?
I'm going to go with, I think, a team that has been a little bit of an afterthought throughout this. It's USC. And, we've had our fair share of criticisms for USC and Lincoln Riley on this show over the last year or so. And you know what? I stand by a lot of the things I've said, but I do think some of that is maybe a little bit overblown. I think, obviously have had so many defensive issues the last 2 seasons. They finally made the move to get rid of Alex Grinch. Yeah, that was sort of a better late than never kind of thing, but hey, he did it. And I think the move to go get DeAnton Lynn from UCLA was a really good one. They had a very solid defense. They've added some transfers. I think the question is, is the defense fixed? Because they don't have Caleb Williams anymore. And I know, as we'll get into in a little bit, I know you're not necessarily completely sold on Miller Moss at quarterback, and neither am I, because we haven't seen him play that much other than that bowl game in which he looked pretty good. What I will say, though, which is kind of something I feel like no one's even talking about, is that they got Jaden Mayava in the transfer portal, who was really good at UNLV last year. So, even if Miller Moss isn't the guy, they have an experienced backup. And, I just think looking at Lincoln's track record coaching quarterbacks, I think you got to trust that between one of those two guys, he's probably going to get pretty good quarterback play this year. I think a lot of it just boils down to how does the defense look? And I don't think this is a team that's good enough to win the Big Ten. Would it shock me if this is a team that was good enough to maybe get in the playoff conversation? Not necessarily. I don't think that would shock me.
Especially Lincoln Riley had a history of getting teams to the playoff, right? He did it 3 times at Oklahoma. Obviously, he never won a playoff game, but he came really close against Georgia, really good Georgia team. Yeah, but also you look at the schedule and why you can probably buy in the fact that they are going to have a really good season. They open it up against Utah State. Oh, boy, they got problems down there at Utah State. Then they have to play Michigan. Or I'm sorry, they open it up against LSU and then play Utah State. The LSU game, that's going to be tough. That is massively tough. Yes, neutral field game.
In Vegas, though, so probably will be more USC friendly. You would probably. I don't know. I said that out loud, and then I thought about LSU fans given the opportunity to travel to Vegas, and now I'm not so sure.
Right, absolutely. So that it's going to be interesting because we get to see 2 teams trying to figure out their quarterback situation. Obviously, LSU, Garrett Nussmeier, Miller Moss over at USC. 2 teams. Their quarterbacks went number 1 and number 2 overall in the NFL draft. They both won Heisman's. There's a lot of storylines going on here. Oh yeah, and don't forget that all those rumors about Lincoln Riley going to LSU only to go to USC, and then Brian Kelly leaves Notre Dame. But I digress. It's an interesting schedule once you get beyond that. Utah State. Then they have to go to Michigan. That's tough. Then Wisconsin at home, Minnesota on the road. But they get Penn State at home. And then the back half of the schedule, their toughest games, I think, Washington in Seattle in early November. Then obviously anytime USC and UCLA get together, it's a tough matchup no matter who's better. And then they close out the season against Notre Dame. It's going to be a tough one, I think. They have some favorable matchups, where it's home versus road. But I do like USC. But again, you kind of talked about it earlier about me not being sold. And I'll get more into that in a moment. But I like the pick from your perspective. Why not Washington? And they're a team, again, much like USC that nobody's talking about. Yes, they did have to replace their head coach with Kalen DeBoer going to the Alabama job. But you could do a lot worse than Jed Fish. We saw what he did at Arizona with minimal. They couldn't pour money into the program like Washington can because of state rules or state employee rules. I don't really want to get into that on this podcast, but you look at what they brought in. The all-time leading passer in Mississippi State history, Will Rogers. You looked at some of the weapons that they brought over. I really thought we were going to talk about Noah Fafita at Washington, but he opted to stay right where he was. But I still think I look at Washington, and yet while it can be tough year one in that transition, I still think that they have enough to be a bowl bowl eligible team. I still think they have enough to have success in the new Big Ten. Um, the travel would be my concern going across country a lot, but I digress. I'm going to go with the Huskies.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's out of the question. I just have, I think, a few too many questions here. And I really like Jed Fish, by the way. Like, before Jed Fish took this job, he was a guy that was on my radar if the team that I root for had to replace one William Napier after this year. So, like, a guy that I definitely like quite a bit. But I think that they just lost so much to both the drafts, with Michael Penix and Polk and Romo Dunze. Like, all those guys are gone. They had, between that and the portal deluge of guys leaving when Kalen DeBoer took the Alabama job, ones that went to Alabama and ones that didn't, like, Asa Turner, their starting safety, went to Florida. So, like, they definitely, I think it's going to be tough. I would feel a lot better if they had managed to pull off the portal coup of Noah Fafita, like we talked about possibly happening last week. I think, because I look at Will Rogers and, like, he's got a great track record. I think maybe barring this past season, but nothing was really working for them at Mississippi State this past season. I just really wonder, because he's very much a system quarterback. Like, he was running the air raid, like, in its purest form with Mike Leach. And that's where the success came. And you wonder, especially with a guy in Jed Fish, whose background is as an NFL offensive coordinator, you do kind of question how that fit is gonna work out. And that's, I think, my biggest question here. They did bring in a lot of transfers too, including a few starters from Arizona. One guy I'd highlight is Jonah Coleman, who was an 800-yard rusher last year. I mean, obviously schedule is going to get tougher here. They do manage to dodge Ohio State and Penn State, though, which is kind of nice. Obviously, they've got Oregon and USC, like you said. But yeah, and Michigan too, I think. But yes, I mean, like, I can see them being better than we're expecting. I think they're going to fall off pretty significantly from where they've been. And I think that's why it's going to be hard for us to call them like a surprise team.
There's a lot of projection with my pick here. Just looking at, who could be it. I mean, because obviously if I would have said Oregon, but I felt like that was too easy, too low hanging. So let's talk about the newcomer that'll struggle real quick as we get ready to wrap up this episode. I'm going to go with those USC Trojans. I'm not sold on Miller Moss at quarterback, and obviously we talked about it. I mean, you said you're not exactly sold because, it's kind of like the situation going on in Norman, Oklahoma with Jackson Arnold, which the only time that we saw him play was he struggled against Arizona in the bowl game, in the Valero Alamo Bowl. And then I look at Miller Moss where, maybe he had a little more success for USC. I'm still not, like I said, I'm still not exactly thrilled with his ability. And I think a lot of that has to do with not knowing what's around him and obviously going into a much tougher conference. They're going to have much harder games to play on a week in and week out basis. So that's why I'm not as in on USC Trojans. But with that being said, it's hard to go against Lincoln Riley, the quarterback whisperer from Muleshoe, Texas, which I know a little bit about. I know a little bit about that area. So, but they're going to be probably, it's probably not going to be as bad as we think or as good as we think. They're somewhere in the middle. But I think for USC fans and Lincoln Riley, that's going to be very disappointing for both parties.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I think you're going to find out if the defense is better. I think you're going to find that out real quick because they're playing an LSU team that, we'll talk about them on the show next week when we preview the SEC. Like, a lot of questions. I don't really think the offense is one of them. I think this is going to be a pretty electric offense once again this year. So, and it's going to be much more, I think, deep ball. I mean, not that Jaden Daniels didn't throw the deep ball a lot, but Garrett Nussmeier can't run like Jaden Daniels can. This is going to be a much more pass-oriented attack. We're going to see how much better USC's gotten on that side of the ball right away. And, I understand where you're coming from. I think, you do maybe wonder a little bit if the Notre Dame game last year was some sort of canary in the coal mine with how their protection just collapsed. Caleb Williams had the worst game of his college career. You do maybe worry if you're playing teams of that caliber, 4 or 5 times a year instead of just once or twice. What's that going to look like? We'll see. I'm doing some projection of my own. I think between the D'Anton Lynn hire and the defensive transfer portal additions, I think they improve enough to sort of stay in the mix in that upper third of the new Big Ten.
And then obviously you're going to go across town with your pick for the one that's going to have the most disappointing first year in the new Big Ten, the UCLA Bruins. And truth be told, I have a hard time disagreeing with this one.
Yeah, and I'm not even a UCLA doomer or anything like that. Like this is kind of more just the by default answer because I think the other teams that are coming in are just coming in a much better situation for a number of reasons. I mean, obviously, like I think this is just going to be tough this year. I don't really see it happening for this particular team. Tough spot. Deshaun Foster, the new head coach, comes into. Chip Kelly leaves in February. Like I think it was late January or February or something like that. Like they had to make a really late hire. And I think when you look at, just the pieces here, like obviously, like I mentioned earlier, losing Dante Moore, wasn't great last year by any means, but a guy that I think in terms of how they were building their roster, they were really anticipating would be there this year. I mean, they've still got Ethan Garbers, who started most of last season, was okay, pretty efficient, not super productive. And then, TJ Harden was a solid running back. They bring back their top 2 receivers. So it's not like they had a massive, collapse of the roster. That didn't happen despite the coaching change and the portal opening late for them. But I don't think they're going to be good enough this year, especially losing D'Anton Lynn to their rival USC. I don't think this is a bottom 5 Big Ten team. I really don't. Some people do. I've seen people that are that low on this UCLA team. I'm not. I think to me, they're still a cut above the Michigan States of the world and the Indianas of the world. And even Illinois probably and Purdue. But I don't see them being anywhere even near, even I would say Washington, which is of the other 3 newcomers, they're the one I'm the lowest on.
Yeah. I mean, it's tough. I mean, I think maybe 4-8, 5-7 is kind of their ceiling. When you look at this team, I think that they could potentially challenge for a bowl bid, but like you said, it's going to be tough. Like Ethan Garbers, when you look at a roster like this, I need a quarterback who can kind of elevate the play around him. You're not going to get that with Ethan Garbers. He's a very pedestrian quarterback in that regard. But he's still good enough to win you some games. The problem is they did lose some talent. They, obviously they lost their star quarterback, who, like you said, they were banking on him kind of sticking around. The writing was on the wall for so long because it seemed like Kelly was trying to interview for any and every open coordinator position, NFL, college. He didn't care.
But they almost fired him. They almost fired him before
right.
they beat USC. So.
Right. They almost fired him, and then he leaves. And they didn't do great in the portal. Obviously the portal opened late for them. But looking at this team, yeah, I can see it. I'm probably more one of those doom and gloom guys. I think 3 to 4 wins is the max for this roster. I mean, I'm not sold on this team, but I am sold on Deshaun Foster. I think that he's the right head coach for this program. I think that he will bring a lot of excitement. But I agree with you 100%. I think this is one of those teams that's going to suffer in the new look Big Ten. But next week, we get to talk SEC, where it just means more. It just means
yes, it does.
A lot more. Texas, Oklahoma. What does Alabama look like in year 1 after Nick Saban is retired? Is this now Kirby Smart's conference? There's so much to get into, and we're going to get into all of that. And even after that, we got to do some college football 25 talk. We got to talk about this new video game coming out. I'm so excited. After a decade, I finally get my hands on this game next week. I'm pumped for it. You know, but before we get to that, we got SEC. But that's going to do it for this edition of the College 12 Pack. As always, download it, check us out, iTunes, Google Play, wherever you get your podcast.